Final events. Welcome to the time we live in. Yes, it is the time that Daniel labeled time of the end, and with which he will conclude his book in the last chapter. Do you like our time? There are many things that are good and others that are not. But the best thing about our time for us believers in biblical prophecies is to know that we live at the very gates of eternity. It is in chapter 12 that all critical interpretations that do not recognize Daniel as an authentic prophet receive their final coup de grace. Indeed, an effort to find a fulfillment of Daniel's prophetic dates in the Seleucid Greek era has completely failed, to such an extent that an author went so far as to say that Daniel wrote the events shortly before they occurred and predicted that date, convinced that the Seleucids would be expelled. But because he wrote in advance of the facts, he couldn't know, according to him, the exact date, and that's why his prediction wasn't accurate. No, my beloved brothers, the Bible is not a purely human product, but a divine one. The pretense that the prophet talked about things he did not know is an excuse for those who have chosen the wrong picture for the dates he gave of the prophesied events. Daniel 12 tells us that the time when the prophetic dates would culminate would be the time of the end, when Michael, Christ himself, would stand up in behalf of his people before the heavenly court and before the world in his second coming. It is the time when Christ will save his people forever and will be manifested by the final resurrection of the dead. This was not going to happen at the time when the Greeks prevailed before Christ's first appearance. Daniel was not thinking of Antiochus Epiphanes, rather the final triumph of the government of God in his sanctuary, the arrival and establishment of the eternal kingdom of the Son of Man after the judgment, and the destruction of all the kingdoms of the world to establish God's kingdom. Who is the central personage in the book of Daniel? It is not a Seleucid king who most people have never heard of today. It is he who receives several names in Daniel's book. When he appears to save his three brave witnesses in the most powerful court in the world in those days, he presents himself as the Son of God, as the ambassador par excellence of heaven. When he appears before the final judgment of heaven, he represents us before the angels of God as the Son of Man. Both titles, Son of Man and the Son of God, Jesus applied to himself in the New Testament. In chapter 8, he is depicted as the Treiyer-Sabbath, the prince of the army, or of the hosts, and as the Treiyer-Sabbath, the prince of princes, as well as when the Apostle Peter recognized him as the prince or chief shepherd, 1 Peter 5 verse 4. And the Apostle Paul in the Apocalypse recognized him as the prince of the kings of the earth, Revelation 1:5, the King of kings and the Lord of lords, Revelation 17:14 and 19:16. Such a title could never be applied to an ancient Greek king named Antiochus Epiphanes. Chapter 9 calls that heavenly being Prince Messiah. Messiah means anointed in English and Christ in Greek. We must remember that the princes were anointed with a hollow horn of oil poured on their heads. Priests were likewise considered princes and anointed in the same manner. Indeed, Christ would be both king and priest, for he would perform a continuous priestly intercession on behalf of his people in his sanctuary in heaven. But in Daniel 9, instead of Tsar, Daniel uses the term Nagid, meaning prince, as well, which in turn was never used in the Bible to speak of a heavenly prince. And when we study the context of this prophecy, we see that it has to do with the human coming of the Messiah in his mortal condition, for he would die for his people. In chapter 10, that Christ or Messiah is Michael, which means who like God. And he is so important in heaven that he is above Gabriel. His power is also above the rebellious angels who seek to oppose him in the spiritual battles that occur around the empires of this world. In chapter 11, he is called Prince Nagid again, Prince of the Covenant, again in his earthly stage, at the time when he died for his people, as we saw in chapter 9. In chapter 12, he is called again Michael, the great prince, Tsar, who is like God, who in the time of final anguish stands forever on behalf of his people. He is our great or high priest in the court of heaven when the book of life is opened. At that time, Daniel says in chapter 12, verse 1. What time? The time of the end already referred to in verse 40. At the time when on earth secular and religious powers fight for dominance. What was Michael going to do at that time? Literally, he was going to stand up in the most holy place of the heavenly temple to vindicate all whose names were written in the book of life. This brings us back to the vision of judgment when the Son of Man appears before the divine court to receive the kingdom. It is the same vision seen by the Apostle John of the Lamb who appears to receive the book of the kingdom in Revelation 5. Then I saw a lamb looking as if it had been slain, standing at the center of the throne, encircled by the four living creatures and the elders. He went and took the scroll from the right hand of him who sat on the throne, Revelation 5, verse 6 and 7. John sees him standing, as people used to appear before an earthly court in the case of the Lamb to defend our cause. Jesus is often depicted by Ellen G. White as standing when he appears at the end before the heavenly court. Let us look at one of her first visions. I saw the Father rise from the throne, and in a flaming chariot go into the Holy of Holies, within the veil, and did sit. There I saw thrones that I had never seen before. Then Jesus rose up from the throne in the holy place, and he stepped into the chariot and was borne to the holiest where the Father sat. There I beheld Jesus as he was standing before the Father, a great high priest. This court of elders and cherubs and thousands and millions of angels acclaims God and Christ when they finally assume the kingdom at the time of the seventh trumpet. The ceremony takes place again in the most holy place, Revelation 11:19. And before this court of elders and cherubs, the 144,000 and the great multitude will also appear at the conclusion of the judgment, Revelation 7 and Revelation 14 and chapter 19. Note that twice in Daniel 12:1 the prophet refers to Michael as standing up. At that time, the great prince who stands up for the children of your people will stand up, a literal translation. He stands first to intercede for all who are inscribed in the book of life, and then to come to redeem them and destroy the world for its wickedness. The emphasis is on the conclusion of the judgment and the final liberation of his people, as when the kings rose to go to war and defend their people. In that final context, Daniel again sees the man dressed in linen he had seen earlier, when he received his last vision. As we saw in our commentary on chapter 10, unlike the regular dress of the year, that celestial being is dressed in the linen texture used by the high priest on the Day of Atonement, when he entered the most holy place to purify the temple from the sins that the Lord had assumed in his temple. And again, he points out the time of the end for the conclusion of the 1260, 1290, and 1335 days years. These dates elapse within the 2,300 years anticipated in chapter 8, which also culminate in the time of the end. Let us look at Daniel 8:13's questions, seen under a literal translation, where we will repeat by ellipsis the question, until when? Until when the vision? The answer is given in Daniel 8:14, until 1844, that is, after 2,300 years. Until when the Tamid, or regular priestly intercession of the Prince of the Heavenly Army in the holy place of his temple? The answer is found in Daniel 8:14 again, until 1844. The word continuous was never used to refer to the ministry of the high priest in the most holy place. Until when the rebellion of desolation that tramples the sanctuary, removing the continued intercession of the heavenly prince? The answer is given in Daniel 12:11, until 1798, at the end of 1290 years. Until when the trample of the army, in reference to the people of the prince of the army? The response is given in Daniel 7:25 and 12:7-9, until 1798, at the end of the 1260 years expressed in terms of time, times, and half a time. Let us consider now the historical fulfillment of the taking away of the continuous intercession and the imposition of the abomination of desolation. We do not have time to bring up here all the abundant historical documentation we have today to confirm the prophetic fulfillment of the dates announced by Daniel and repeated in more detail by John in the book of Revelation. I offer an extensive documentation in my book, The Apocalyptic Times of the Sanctuary. What interests us more here is to understand how Jesus applied this prophecy in the Gospels, and how to understand it in the light of all what Daniel said about the removal of Christ's continuous intercession in the heavenly sanctuary by the abomination of the papacy, which causes horror to man and heaven. Jesus projected into the future the abomination of desolation that the prophet Daniel spoke of. Again, we see here that if we are going to continue to call ourselves Christians, we cannot associate that prophecy with the Seleucid invasion of the Greek king Antiochus Epiphanes in the 2nd century before Christ. And John, in the book of Revelation, at the end of the 1st century of the Christian era, even after the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans, projected this prophecy into medieval times. First, let us look at what Jesus stated. So, when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Matthew 24, verse 15. Jesus' first application of this prophecy of Daniel was, therefore, the abomination that the Roman army would install with its idolatrous banners in front of the temple of Jerusalem. Matthew 24, verse 15, 21:20, Luke 21:20. Did he refer to the bust that Emperor Hadrian put in Jerusalem, or to the imposition of Sunday, the day of the sun god, after Jerusalem was destroyed and renamed Aelia Capitolina? Roman idolatry, which according to the Bible is an abomination, was more than an idol. It had to do with multiple idolatries that were depicted in the idolatrous banners of his soldiers. In these banners, they used to bear the image of the emperor who was revered and worshipped. They also bore the image of an eagle with the sign SPQR, a symbol of the Senate and the Roman people. The eagle was a symbol of the power emanating from the Roman gods. When Constantine nominally converted to Christianity, he changed the image of the emperor to that of Christ. But why did Christ add, "Let the reader understand"? This expression was used by the Lord when he spoke in parables. This allows us to understand that the abomination of the Roman soldiers over Jerusalem in the 1st century was to be viewed as a parable or symbol of the most gruesome abomination that would be established in the church when it would be ruled by the papacy. Are we given a double interpretation of the apocalyptic prophecy of Daniel? No. Jesus saw a double application of the abomination of desolation based on Daniel 9:27, where Daniel spoke of more than one abomination. First would be the abomination of pagan Rome, and then the abomination of papal Rome that succeeded it. Let us translate literally Daniel 9:27, taking into account the context of the previous verse. And upon a place of the temple there will be abominations of desolation, or that cause horror, until the determined destruction is completed and poured out, and desolated the temple or the city, according to verse 26. When we go to the Apocalypse, we see that the woman of the Lamb, the true church or remnant of the Lord, had to flee throughout the long medieval tribulation from a place where the dragon had been able to enter, the Catholic Church, to the desert, where it would be sustained by the Lord. Revelation 12, verse 6 and 14. So also the newly born church of the Lord had to flee from old Jerusalem. Reflected in the Roman imperial idolatrous abomination in the holy place of the earthly temple, Christians in the coming centuries would be able to see the idolatrous abomination of the Roman papacy in the middle of the Christian church, usurping the ministry that Jesus exercises in the holy place of the heavenly temple. How did the Protestants understand the prophecy of Daniel and the application of Jesus regarding the abomination of desolation, as represented the dreadful idolatry of the Roman papacy that would be established in the midst of the spiritual temple, that is, the church? In my book, The Apocalyptic Times of the Sanctuary, that I mentioned some moments ago, I give a list of Protestant authors who saw the fulfillment of this prophecy of Daniel, referred to again by Christ fulfilled in their days. Let us quote some of them like John Huss, Martin Luther, and others. Let's see first what John Huss said. Surely, even at this day is the malice, the abomination and filthiness of Antichrist, revealed in the Pope and others of this council. Now the faithful servants of God may understand what our Savior Christ meant by this, saying, when you shall see the abomination of desolation, which is spoken of by Daniel. The papacy is the abomination of self-deification in the holy place. Woe then is me if I do not preach of that abomination, if I do not weep over it, write about it. The Pope and the cardinals become the abomination of desolation, a college opposed to the humble college of the apostles of our Lord. The testimony of the Protestant martyr Lord Cobham, whose condemnation took place in the year 1413, was also categorical. To the Pope I owe neither suit nor service. He is the great Antichrist, the son of perdition, the abomination of desolation in the holy place. The same was declared by the Lollard Protestant Walter Brute. The High Bishop of Rome, he said, is the idol of desolation sitting in the temple of God, taking away Christ's continual sacrifice. This idol must be revealed to the Christian people by the testimony of Daniel, whereof Christ speaketh in the Gospel. When ye shall see the abomination of desolation that was told of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let him that readeth understand. In addition to applying the term abomination of desolation to the Roman standards that were placed in and around all Jerusalem, the worship of the bust of the emperor in what was once the most holy place of the temple and the destruction of the city of Jerusalem, Luther saw a future fulfillment of the imposition of the abomination of desolation. He said, this passage in Daniel concerning the abomination applies also to us. For we also have indeed a real abomination of desolation sitting in a holy place, namely in Christendom and in the consciences of men, where God alone should sit and reign. What is the Pope doing? He is seated not in the natural temple or God's house, but in the spiritual, in the new and living temple of which Paul says, if any man destroyeth the temple of God, him shall God destroy, for the temple of God is holy, which temple ye are. 1 Corinthians 3, verses 16 to 17, quoted by Luther. Thus you see whether the Pope is not the greatest such abomination of all abominations, to whom Christ and Daniel refer, and the true Antichrist, of whom it is written that he sitteth in the temple of God. And he can in truth be called an abomination of desolation. Our text refers not only to the Jews, but also to our abomination, the Pope's kingdom, said Luther. In another place, Luther insists on this interpretation on saying, but why doth the Pope name himself an earthly God, as though the true only and almighty God in heaven were not also a God on earth? Truly, the Pope's kingdom is a horrible wrath of God, an abomination of desolation which standeth in the holy place, as Christ, speaking directly of it, said, whoso readeth, let him understand. Matthew 24. This is now the abomination of desolation that has reigned until our time, said Luther, but is now revealed through the grace of God. And Luther links that abomination with the Great Tribulation. To Pope Leo, Luther wrote, years set in this holy place for no other cause but only to be the abomination spoken of in Daniel, which should put down truth and set up lies and the operation of error, for this thing and no other become the seed of Antichrist. Daniel points out directly to the Pope. Since the Pope is the Antichrist, I believe him to be a devil incarnate. Words of Luther. The Reformers understood clearly that the papacy was the abomination foretold by the Bible, with all its arsenal of idolatries. Daniel referred to these reformers as wise men, with many of them falling to be cleaned and whitened, Daniel 11:33 and 35. But their understanding would increase, Daniel 12:10, and reach especially the time of the end when the book of Daniel was finally unsealed. In agreement with the reformers, Ellen G. White referred also the abominations and absurdities that marked her reign, that of the Church, during the centuries of ignorance and darkness. Great Controversy, page 563, etc. In 508, Clovis, king of the Franks, after being baptized as a Catholic, he established its capital in Paris as a union of church and state. His tribe was the first barbaric Germanic whore or tribe to become Catholic. This involved the recognition of the Pope's supremacy in Gaul and the beginning of religious intolerance in his domains. Clovis began a crusade in France against the enemies of the Roman papacy, and that nation became regarded by the popes as the eldest daughter or firstborn and even predilect daughter of the Church. It was also the nation that first imposed the courts of the Inquisition, until its fidelity to Rome was breached in 1798, when General Berthier took the Pope prisoner and declared that no authority should emanate from that see again. In 538, Emperor Justinian dispatched his general Belisarius, who freed the Pope from the Arian Ostrogoths who were in control of Rome. That began the temporary domination of the papacy. It brought Justinian's decree of 533 into effect. That decree subjected all the other churches of Asia to the authority of the Roman Pontiff, who he addressed with a blasphemous title, His Holiness. The culmination of the 1260 years is the same as that of the 1290 years. We will look shortly at the fulfillment of the 1335 years. Let us now consider some divine warnings against futurism. Some brethren have been trying to project a double fulfillment of some of these prophecies. They believe that the prophetic dates follow the course of the events described in chapter 11. But structurally, Daniel 12, verses 6 to 13, is in the explanatory section of the prophecy. Just as in every previous vision, after the description of the vision comes an explanatory section of what was revealed to the prophet. So also at the conclusion of the last vision in Daniel 12:4 comes an explanatory section of about 7 verses. Therefore, the attempt to place that explanatory part of the vision in the final events is unfounded. In Daniel 2, we find first the description of the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, and then the interpretation and explanation of Daniel. In chapter 7, we find first the description of the vision of the fourth beast and the judgment, and then in the second section, the interpretation and explanation of the vision by the angel. In Daniel 8, we find again first the description of the vision of the ram and the goat, and the cleansing of the sanctuary, and then the interpretation and explanation of the angel in the second section. Daniel 9 gives an additional explanation concerning the first part of the 2,300 years. It is not a projection that succeeds the 2,300 years. Finally, in Daniel 11, we can see again the same literary structure. First comes the depiction of the struggles involved in the prophecy, which culminate in Daniel 12:4 with the resurrection of the dead. Then, since Daniel 12:6-13, we find the explanation of that vision, not a revelation of something that was expected to happen after Daniel 12 verses 1-4. It has to do at the same time with a kind of epilogue where the whole visions of the former chapters are clarified. Practically all the terms used in connection with the prophetic dates show the prophet's greatest concern, which is the amazing work and words, pelaot in Hebrew, of the king of the north and of the little horn, or medieval Roman papacy in its fulfillment. Let us not separate, therefore, the equivalent terms of previous visions to place them in another context in the last chapter. Neither by Hebrew nor by its Greek translation can we deny the connection of the pelaot of Daniel 12:6, incredible things, with the niplaot of Daniel 8:24 and 11:36. They all refer to the astonishing words and declaration of the Roman papacy. Such terms do not appear in relation to the time of the end, namely in Daniel 11:40-12:4. Some of our futurist brethren also mention the statement of the Spirit of prophecy that history will be repeated, and infer that the prophetic days that were fulfilled in the past will be fulfilled again, this time literally. However, the Spirit of prophecy does not say that the prophecy will be repeated, but that history will be repeated. In addition to the quotations based on the angel of Revelation 10, that there will be no space of any kind of time specified between 1844 and the second coming of Christ, we will highlight here some significant quotations from Ellen G. White. Some will take the truth applicable to their time and place it in the future. Events in the train of prophecy that had their fulfillment away in the past are made future, and thus, by these theories, the faith of some is undermined. From the light that the Lord has been pleased to give me, you are in danger of doing the same work, presenting before others truths which have had their place and done their specific work for the time in the history of the faith of the people of God. You recognize these facts in Bible history as true, but apply them to the future. They have therefore still in their proper place in the chain of events that have made us as a people what we are today, and as such they are to be presented to those who are in the darkness of error. This statement is in the second volume of Selected Messages, page 102. Another statement. The great waymarks of truth showing us our bearings in prophetic history are to be carefully guarded, lest they be torn down and replaced with theories that would bring confusion rather than genuine light, in page 101 of the same book. In addition, the Tamid or continuous priestly ministry of Christ goes until 1844, and the removal of that Tamid by an impostor prince reaches the year 1798. In that year, the political authority of the papacy was taken from him after usurping the heavenly priesthood of Jesus for 1290 years. From then on, the popes could not imprison or torture or send anyone else to the stake for rejecting their impostor priesthood. So, attempts to project that removal of the priesthood of Jesus after 1844 is meaningless. Jesus is from then on in the most holy place, and the ministry of final purification in that place was never described as a tamid or regular or continuous priestly ministry. Yes, Jesus is continually interceding for us in the judgment court, but that final intercession in the most holy place of the heavenly temple was not represented by the word tamid in the holy place. Let us read a statement of the book The Great Controversy. In the service of the earthly sanctuary, which is a figure of the service in the heavenly, when the high priest on the Day of Atonement entered the most holy place, the ministration in the first apartment ceased. God commanded, "There shall be no man in the tabernacle of the congregation when he goeth in to make an atonement in the holy place until he comes out." Leviticus 16, verse 17. So when Christ entered the Holy of Holies to perform the closing work of the atonement, he ceased his ministration in the first apartment. But when the ministration in the first apartment ended, the ministration in the second apartment began. Great Controversy, page 428. In addition, we have already seen in the first lesson that apocalyptic prophecies are not conditional as to require a different future fulfillment. The spirit of prophecy is very clear about this. Among the many statements of her warnings about not giving future applications to the apocalyptic days, we cite here one. There will never again be a message for the people of God that will be based on time. We are not to know the definite time either for the outpouring of the Holy Spirit or for the coming of Christ. I saw that some were getting a false excitement arising from preaching time, that the third angel's message can stand on its own foundation and that it needs no time to strengthen it. We are not to live upon time excitement. We are not to be engrossed with speculations in regard to the times and the seasons which God has not revealed. The first volume on Selected Messages, pages 188 and 189. Satan will be ready to give to anyone who is not learning every day of Jesus a special message of his own creating in order to make of no effect the wonderful truth for this time. Page 191 of the same book. Now let us consider the date 1335 years. Because of their relationship to the previous verse, the 1335 years begin at the same time as the 1290 years. If that beginning was in the year 508, then its culmination should lead us to 1843. But if we take into account that the period of 2,300 years is based on the Jewish calendar that began in the autumn, and that 1335 years have a starting point in the Roman Julian calendar, we see that the 1335 days reach the first part of the year 2300. Daniel 12:12 says, "Blessed is the one who waits for and reaches the end of the 1335 days, years in prophetic calculation." Why would the one who patiently waits for the arrival of that time be blessed? Because those who suffered martyrdom during the 1260 and 1290 years had been crying out before the altar of the heavy intercession, "How long, sovereign Lord, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood?" Revelation 6 and verse 10. But those who came to the conclusion of that long time may be happy to know that the time of judgment, whose purpose is to vindicate them before the universe, would have at last come. And in reference to that time, John saw that those who died from that hour of judgment would be blessed. Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, said the Spirit, they will rest from their labor, for their deeds will follow them. Revelation 14, verse 13. The angel commands Daniel to seal from his prophecies everything related to the time of the end, because in his days it would be very hard to understand. But when the time came, that portion of his prophecies was to be understood and proclaimed to the world. The angel declares, "Go your way till the end, and you shall rest and shall stand in your goral at the end of the days." Daniel 12:13, the last verse of the book of Daniel. When? At the end of all the prophetic days or years that were given to Daniel, that is till the time of the end. What does goral mean in Hebrew? It is often translated as lot or allotment. Not because it necessarily reflected fate, but because it had to do with divine revelation. The two stones by which the high priest consulted God were the Urim and Thummim. When God made the stone on the left shine, it meant no. And when he made the stone on the right shine, it meant yes. But by this means, God assigned the inheritance to the tribes of Israel, and also the position or commitment or place to be assumed by or occupied by the priest. You find this in 1 Chronicles 24 and 25 and 26. The context of Daniel 12:13 is the conclusion of the prophetic days that lead to the time of the end, when what Daniel had foretold would be understood at that time. In other words, Daniel is comforted that what he did not understand would be understood and disclosed at the time of the end. This is how Ellen G. White understood the last statement of the angel in numerous testimonies. She went so far as to affirm that those who do not understand what the Antichrist is will be assimilated by the world and will side with the Antichrist. Let us look at some testimonies. Daniel is today standing in his lot, and we are to give him place to speak to the people. Daniel stood in his lot to bear his testimony, which was sealed until the time of the end, when the first angel's message should be proclaimed to our world. Daniel has been standing in his lot since the seal was removed and the light of truth has been shining upon his visions. He stands in his lot, bearing the testimony which was to be understood at the end of the days. May God help us to stand like Daniel in our lot and place during the days of probation that remain. Those who become confused in their understanding of the word, who fail to see the meaning of Antichrist, will surely place themselves on the side of Antichrist. There is no time now for us to assimilate with the world. Daniel is standing in his lot and in his place. The prophecies of Daniel and of John are to be understood. Another statement. The time has come for Daniel to stand in his lot. The time has come for the light given him to go to the world as never before. If those for whom the Lord has done so much will walk in the light, their knowledge of Christ and the prophecies relating to him will be greatly increased as they near the close of this earth history. If, like Daniel, We look at the time of the end as a unit without temporal computation. We can understand with Ellen G. White that Daniel is today standing in the Adventist church, proclaiming through that church his message intended to be preached and expanded in the time of the end, in the three angels' messages of Revelation 14. That is, from 1798 and 1844 to the end of the time of grace. This is the assignment or commitment that the Lord gave to Daniel for the time we are living, which is fulfilled by our church. If we make our that promise of the angel to Daniel, we will receive together with him the promised inheritance. So be it. Amen.